Our next speaker is Gwilym Griffiths from the Good Canopy Company. Gwilym is an urban greening professional with a passion for planning, design and delivery of innovative green and blue infrastructure to assist in the creation of livable cities. He is a qualified arborist, landscape gardener, horticulturist and project manager with over 20 years experience spanning both government and private organisations. He has extensive experience in the connection of strategy with operational capability and has hands-on knowledge of the challenges and solutions that exist with both. Today he will be focusing on strategy to implementation, how to set realistic targets based on organisational capacity. Would you all please welcome Gwilym Griffiths.
Fantastic. Thanks everyone, pleasure to be here. And actually before we start, I always like to know who I'm talking to, so I'd love to find out who's in the audience and what you all do. So can I have a hands up for all the landscape architects in the room? There's a lot. Arborists. Yeah, there's a lot of them. Planners. Not so many. That's good, at least there's some, that's good. And engineers. Hey, represent. Excellent. I can see 2 engineers, all right, okay. I'll try and be nice to you, I promise, I won't be too mean. I've probably forgotten others. Academic scientists, there's at least one. A few, good. Doctors. Okay, how many doctors? Oh, excellent, there's a few, there's 2, excellent. Who else have I forgotten? Artists. Fantastic. Great spread of disciplines here. But my background is predominantly local government, so my talk is very much geared towards council and operations. So if you're not council operations, you can go, but please stay. I hope you do. I've got control. Okay, first I want to do some acknowledgements. Firstly, acknowledgement of the traditional owners. We're here on Durrag land. I've come from Gadigal land today. And acknowledge the importance of Aboriginal custodial and cultural connection to place. These were the first people that cared for our country. If we let them keep doing it, we'd probably be in a much better place. I also want to acknowledge my peers and colleagues. A lot of what I'm presenting today is collective knowledge from the industry. It's not exclusively my knowledge. I just want to make that clear. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm talking about strategy to implementation. I do consulting, so my main focus is consulting with councils, doing urban forest strategies, street tree master plans, strategies that lead the way urban forests are managed at a local level. So, and what I'm seeing a lot of is that there's often a gap between what the strategy says and what's happening on ground. A lot of councils have got some really good strategies, some really good targets, but they don't actually match what's actually happening. So I'm going to be talking today about what's needed to set realistic targets and how to implement them. So firstly, a bit of background. A long time ago in a council far away, I started my journey in urban forestry. I was going to put a joke in about the dark side, but I don't know how to apply that. I started at a time when the organisation actually had an urban forest strategy. It was one of the first councils to do so. It was about 2010, this strategy came in. So I sort of started ahead of the game. I was quite fortunate to actually come to a council that had already put some measures in place to do this stuff. And it had a simple target. It had increase urban canopy. There were no percentages, there were no numbers. It was really just increase canopy. They knew that was important. But it didn't have any clear implementation pathways. It didn't actually talk about how we do that at a really detailed level. It talked about some good actions, develop certain programs, but it didn't actually look at the organisation itself or the capacity of it. So by way of context, that's sort of how I've come to where I am today. My 10 years at council were really spent developing the implementation of a strategy and then later on improving on it. So we've come a long way. The industry, since the last 5 years, most councils now have or are developing urban forest plans or strategies. And there's a real focus on canopy targets and increasing canopy. So these are some of the targets that are out there. You may have seen some of these statistics, but across the globe, there's a real ambition to set these targets. So you can see the 40% number that was been mentioned before today is really figuring heavily there, and there are some others, but the City of Sydney is actually one there that you can see at the top right, is 27% by 2050, which is actually quite far below that 40%, but there's good reason to do that. So the Greater Sydney canopy target was set by the Greater Sydney Commission, and that 40% is based on optimum cooling and health benefits. There was a study done by the US Forestry Service that indicated 40% was the magic number. So that's been applied to a lot of the place. So unfortunately, and this is the doom and gloom slide, the majority of councils are seeing a decline in canopy. Increases in canopy are extremely difficult to achieve, and setting realistic, achievable targets, I think, is key to actually to achieving this stuff. So it's worth mentioning aspirational targets are okay. They have served their function. If we didn't have that 40%, we wouldn't be as far progressed as we are, I think. It has given councils something to aim towards. It provides conversation at many levels as to why canopy is important. So I'm all good with aspirational targets. That's fine. They have their place, as long as they state some of the obvious things. Like where do we want to be, where are we now, and how we get there. So I'm talking about the practical side of things, which is this. So this is what I call the 3 key success factors to growing, to setting achievable targets. So the 3 key elements there are organisational capacity, available space, and growth projections, all of which is encompassed by accurate data. Data is really, really important throughout this whole process to inform all stages. I'm going to go through each one. Organisational capacity. So what is the capacity of the organisation to deliver urban greening outcomes over and above business as usual? That's the question we're trying to answer. And that's assuming that business as usual is not delivering sufficient increases in canopy. This is what I call the Council Olympics. In theory, all these teams are working together to achieve high things. So the first part of that ring is, and this is something I've put together, it's based on some other industry research, but these are the main things I focus on when I'm looking at an organisation and their capacity to deliver improved urban greening. So culture and integration, the questions here are, does the organisation support urban greening? Is there desire at an executive and cultural level? And integration, I'll talk about integration in a bit more detail later on, but it's so important as part of this picture. Are capital works integrated? Do the strategies align? That kind of integration. The second thing is resourcing. Now this is a pretty basic one, I think you probably understand what this is, but are there sufficient staff employed to deliver the programs? So many times you see these aspirational targets and actions that are up to 2-man teams, 2-people teams to deliver these things. They're really not resourced to be doing this level of planting. Are there budgets in place to deliver these programs as well? Are there sufficient data, strategy, data and processes in place? So is there an urban forest plan? Is there an inventory? Are there clear processes on how to deliver effective programs? Sometimes that's very lacking. Second last one is political and executive support. Now this is a sort of magical unicorn that is very hard to control, but it is so important to these plans. Having the political and executive support to actually head out and do the things that you say you're going to do is hugely important. It was mentioned before, it can derail a whole project if you don't have that support. And the last thing is community engagement. Are you trusted by the community? Do you engage with them on tree canopy? Are they aware of the reason you're doing these things? It's really important to bring them along for the journey. How do we measure this? So this is a bit of a framework I've developed, and it's something I've adapted from Tammy Cross's work at RMIT, which he calls the Green Success Factor tool. So I've developed into a bit more of a council-focused series of questions. So basically, I go through these questions with the organisation, and we look at how they score on each one of these categories that I've just talked through, and then we look at that, in terms of how they scored. It's a score out of 40, and that just helps us give us direction and to know where to prioritise and where to focus our efforts, especially with the target and the strategy. So we then go. Probably can't see the level of detail on that. It's probably a bit blurry, but it's the next things we look at operations. We look at the specific functions that relate to council. So we go through the private tree area. We look at how permits are delivered, the processes in place for DA planning, how the DAs work, down to the actual process level with how these things are working, because it can make such a difference. We then look at the planning framework and how it may or may not be working for the organisation. We then go into operational elements like tree maintenance. How is tree maintenance being delivered? A really essential part of the picture. It's not just about planting trees, it's about maintaining them as well to achieve these targets. And then we look at planting programs, obviously for the importance that they provide. And quite often they are very, very under-resourced. That's very, very strong message that comes across with all councils. We then bring all that into our focus areas, which then help us set off and develop the strategy further. Okay, so that was organisational capacity. This is now assessing available space. So important in setting the canopy target. Is there room to actually plant trees to reach this target? That's the question we're asking there. So these are some of the methods that I've seen out there that are available to assess available planting spaces. This has been done with a lot of other companies and colleagues that do this sort of stuff, and it's often done by a lot of people that are way smarter than I am. They're very, very technical savvy. So the first method I've seen out there is what I'm calling the spatial assessment. That's looking at aerial images and satellite data. The street segment method, that's City of Sydney have used that for their current targets. Terrestrial LiDAR and ground-based inspections. I'll go through each one of them quickly. So this is the spatial assessment. Now this is some NASA kind of stuff here. This is people that are way clever than I am. Basically, it's using aerial imagery, satellite or aerial images to aggregate available ground space for planting trees. So this is done as part of canopy mapping projects. This is companies out there that sort of specialise in this kind of stuff. So it requires the mapping of existing canopy, and you can set certain things into this, like parameters such as tree spacing. You tell it, because the end result is to identify available planting space and actual locations to plant trees. So you can tell it tree spacing, distance from intersections, location of power lines. You can see in that bottom image the power lines are represented in blue there. This really gives you an understanding of where your available space is to plant trees. Okay, this is the next method, which I'm calling the land parcel lot segment method. Now, Phil Julian presented on this at TreeNet a couple of years ago, so this is his knowledge, 100%. But a really, really sophisticated method of looking at, not so much looking at available planting space, but identifying how much canopy each land can accommodate. So they've drilled in at the lot level for their 3 land types: streets, parks and private space. And for their street method, they've developed a formula to help assess. Well, Phil called it quite a simple formula, but I don't think that looks very simple to me. Which at the end result is to accommodate, it's to examine what a street can accommodate in terms of canopy. And then they've been able to use that data to create this prioritisation map, so they can drill down into each street segment and look at which streets have high potential or are maxed out for canopy. City of Sydney's always been really good at managing their data. This next method is a fairly new one, but a fairly exciting one. So you may have seen there's quad bikes getting around. They're becoming a really common way for civil engineers to assess footpaths and road conditions. But why can't they inspect for vacant tree sites? Well, they can. I'm working with Blacktown Council at the moment, and they're using this to inform their street tree master plan to identify vacant sites. The technology's out there. It's just, it was up to one person to ask the question, hey, can we do this as well? So the last method out there is the ground-based inspection, which seems quite sort of old-fashioned compared to the method I've just showed you, but it's such a good method for so many other reasons. Especially if you're doing a full street tree inventory as it is, you should be capturing your vacant sites as well as that. Yeah, so we've done available space, organisational capacity, and growth projections. So these are some of the practices I've seen put in place to help assess the potential and impact of growth, both in terms of tree growth, but also development growth, housing, and how that might impact canopy in the future. So if you're setting those targets, it's good to understand, what impacts are going to happen. This is where I get into the graphs a bit, so apologies for showing lots of this graph-heavy stuff. So this is a project that's been done by Kingston Council down in Victoria. This is part of their urban forest strategy that's just been released this year. They've used some historical data around tree removal, tree planting, and factors around foliage growth and foliage loss to estimate their changes over time. So you can see that, from the 2022 to 2024 and onwards is the projection, including their planting programs. They've assumed, their increased planting rate from 2022 to get to what they think will show an increase in canopy by the end of it, factoring in tree removal and tree planting, which is quite a smart way to do it. So this is where our planners come in. We need you guys for this. It's looking at projection data. This was a project that the City of Canning did for their urban forest strategy, and it looks at how much development impacts potential canopy. So it's looking at your undeveloped land versus your developed land, how much growth is there still to come, which is important to consider, and what those impacts might be on canopy. And in doing this, so this was for Ku-ring-gai Council. This is for their urban forest strategy, and developed by a company I work with called Carbon, who do a lot of this mapping. So this actually looked at the land types themselves and actually did some case studies to review what that zoning and what that type of development, what impact that has on canopy. So you can see that top one, R3 medium density residential, that saw an increase in covered land surface and a decline in canopy, which is a pretty common story you will see. But then the bottom example was an interesting one. This looks at the high density residential for a particular site, and it shows there, you can see the far left image, it's a fairly typical housing, large lot setup, plenty of room for trees, plenty of green space, and then it's developed, and then over the course of a decade or so, it's actually increased in canopy. And this is perhaps the exception, not the rule, but it's a good example of how the right provisions in certain planning mechanisms can actually have good results. So this canopy went from 30% to 40%, which is interesting to see. Quite often you would assume the opposite. And I can't talk about canopy targets without talking about Libby Gallagher's work for the Greener Neighbourhoods Guide. So if you haven't seen that already, it's definitely worth looking at. It sets out land canopy targets based on land zoning, and it actually makes the relationship between deep soil and canopy, which is obviously really important. So this project that Libby undertook was more about testing potential canopy again than actually determining impact from development, but it's an assessment of typical available space. Based on actual real DAs. So she actually went through, a mountain of DAs to look at each one and see how it could be done. And that fed into the targets for the Green Neighbourhood Place. Okay, so that's what's needed, I think, to achieve a realistic target. There is one thing missing: implementation. So this is where strategy meets the ground. This is some of the real life stuff that needs to happen to make these strategies work. So forgive me, there's a bit of information on that slide. But the first one is it needs to align with targets. You can't develop these targets in isolation. It's got to align with your community strategic plan, your LSP, your operational plans and performance plans. It's got to go down to that level. Especially if you're setting tree planting targets and figures, that's got to be in the performance plans. Each staff member needs to know they are responsible for a certain level of implementation. The other thing to do with this is actually determine what that, if you're setting an increase in canopy, determine what that actually means in terms of number of trees and put a cost to it. That makes it tangible, and you can actually start planning your budgets and resources to align with that. It's quite hard to associate a percentage with actual trees in most people's minds, especially the community. They don't understand what 40% means. So then develop your organisational capacity, which is easier said than done, but having done that assessment will help identify your gaps. So know where your gaps are, know where you need improvement, and build the business case to make those improvements. The last thing there is monitor. You've got to keep track of your target here. So if you're not measuring, you're just guessing, essentially. So the other thing there is to make them specific, make them smart. You've all seen SMART goals. That's nothing new, but make the target specific. Go down to that land zone level. The more specific, the better in some cases. Measure. Make sure you're using accurate data to measure it and make sure it's repeatable. Attainable. That's what I've just been talking about, making sure they're achievable. Make them relevant and set a time to them. You need to know when to deliver this stuff by. Okay, so I'm going to finish off with a few things on ground. This is stuff actually that you need to get right at a ground level. Get your tree planting programs right. That's the first thing. You see a lot of trees focused on numbers. We've got our state government target of 1 million trees. Which is great, but it's a metric. That's all it is. So sometimes I say less is more, and it's better to plant a few really good trees rather than a lot of average ones. And Ross will touch on that in more detail, I'm sure. So just quickly, I won't go on this for long, but it's important to look at all the factors that actually go into a planting program. It's not just planting a tree, digging a hole, planting a tree. It used to be as simple as that for some, but it's not. So. The first thing to look at is planning and species selection. Actually plan your site, look at actually use the data to inform that. Develop a tree planting prioritisation plan, use that data, and then get the right species. Maximise the species to suit the site. Get some quality stock, plant it correctly, and maintain it. Pretty simple stuff. This is the planting prioritisation that I just mentioned. So you may have seen some of this out there already, but it's a really good way to be strategic with your tree planting programs to maximise the benefits of your planting programs. So it's combining canopy data, heat data, socioeconomic data, and your vacant tree site data, which you've already gathered. So here are some examples. That top one is from the States, from Austin. They've done that at a block mesh kind of level. This bottom one is from Arbor Carbon, who have looked at it at a street level. So it's actually produced a table of priority streets based on those criteria. Get the species right. Now I can't have this talk and not talk about which plant where. One of the programs I work on, but climate is changing. We've already talked about climate and heat being an issue. You need to make sure you're planting the right tree that's going to be there for the next 50, 60 years. So which plant where is a climate-ready plant selector. You can type in your postcode or the species you're looking at, and it'll tell you how suitable that tree is for the future climate. Okay, this is an example of what not to do, sort of. Now, it's a really, really good planting scenario in many ways. They've actually spent a bit of money. There's some tree guards. Fairly mature trees have gone in. Headache horse. It's been done well. Someone has thought about how to do this, but they've chosen the wrong species. That's blueberry ash. in a site that can accommodate huge canopy. There's no parking along that curb, huge footpath, big building setback. Excuse my crude Photoshop, but that's what you should have planted there, or something bigger. So that's what I mean by maximise every opportunity. Another example, this looks great. It's a really good planting in some ways. Again, they've spent some money. They've all got tree guards. Pretty large tree pits. But there's 10 trees there in the space of 20 metres. Where's the soil volume to sustain them for long life? It looks great, and I know that species maculata will do that. But in terms of investment in and canopy out, you're probably getting not the best result. And this example, just don't bother. There's no soil in that. Those trees have failed for obvious reasons. There's no point planting in that scenario. What you could do there is some structural vaults and make that soil volume under the road there. That's definitely an option. There you go, Ben. Okay, and this is the last thing I'll focus on. I think I've gone over, but I'm really focused on integration. Integration within council to deliver tree planting programs shouldn't just be up to the tree team. It should happen at all levels of council. Everyone should be focused on the outcome, on that target. So your parks and streetscapes teams, your landscape architects and park planners, your assets planning, capital works, and your civil design teams. All need to be part of the picture. I love showing this picture. I put it in most of my presentations. It's what a civil engineer would think is a great job. They've done a really good footpath, nice level concrete, beautiful. Is that yours? No, okay, good. Yeah, it's not good. No, you're right. Obviously there's one thing missing. So this is actually an example of when I was at council. This is West Street in Petersham. This is the civil works and the tree team not talking. This is them going in, putting like-for-like concrete back, and not thinking about opportunity for trees. So we came back and did this. The end result was great, but it cost more money. We had to cut up concrete. We had to bring soil in. If that had been done in an integrated approach, it would have been a much better outcome. It looks even better today. That's a few years old, that picture. This is an example of a footpath replacement. This is in Northwood Street, Camperdown. We've got Hills Figs in a fairly small footpath, causing havoc as they do, but providing amazing canopy and really defining that streetscape. So it started off as just a straight footpath renewal. Civil Works were just going to do like for like, and they came to me and said, hey, there's roots in the way, what are we going to do? Implying that we might cut some roots for them. We pulled some budgets together, we thought about other options, and we delivered this. So we actually took the footpath away from against the property boundaries and moved it out into the road. So we narrowed the road shoulder, which has other benefits as well for traffic calming. And then the residents got this huge expanse of garden right outside their front. I would love to live on this street. And the trees got more room and more space to grow as well. So I really like that project. This is the last case study. This is in Marrickville, David Street in Marrickville. This was a road reseal asphalt project, and a good example of good integration. So the civil team said this needs to happen. They approached me and we discussed options. Again, pulled some resources and made this happen. So instead of putting the concrete right back up to the trunk, which is what it was, cars were parking and reversing into these trees, heritage brush box. Expanded the asphalt out, really good tree pits, filled in some of the gaps, some trees that have been removed and not replaced, modified some of the curbing to adjust for flows, and put a permeable edge in. So that's a coir log, which is designed to degrade over time, but we did some planting on the outside, dianellas and other runners that then eventually took over that edge and became a real soft landscape. So no concrete curb that was going to crack over time. And that's it. Thanks very much.